Ask Kim, and I am talking to you today about writing opening scenes. For those of you who don't know me, I am an author. I write children's books as well as young adult books. I've ghostwritten several books as well, but I no longer ghostwrite. I'm best known for the Autumn Nights charity anthologies and for the Wilders trilogy. You can also see my picture books for children that work on speech sound development, available at all major book retailers. Those are the phonological and articulation children's books. We have a new book coming out shortly as soon as the printer gets it printed. So today we're talking about writing opening scenes. As an editor that offers a free 1,500 word sample edit for potential clients, I get to read a lot of book openings every month. Not only do I read book openings in the books that I'm personally reading, not only do I read book openings in the books that I am editing, but I also read them in the sample edits that people send me. You know, I don't tell somebody, oh, send me any sample edit area you want. I always say, please send me the beginning so that I can get a feel for your voice, get a feel for where you're at, because the opening chapter or the opening, first little bit of a book tells you a lot about the writer. Why? Because an opening should set the tone of voice. It should set the tone for the main character. It should set the tone for what sort of conflict we can expect to see, even if it doesn't tell you the exact conflict. And it really just gives you an idea of the point of view, the tense that they're using, and it lets you move forward into what to expect for the rest of the book. So there are a couple different schools of thoughts when it comes to writing an opening scene. There's a school of thought that says, drop me right into the action. Get me started right away. This is not my preferred school of thought. And this is, of course, not a writing rule. This is just a personal opinion as a reader, a writer, and an editor. I do think you need to open with some form of conflict. I do not think that you should open with the actual big conflict of the story for a couple of reasons. Number one, if you open with this big conflict, the inciting incident of your story, what's going to change norm, we don't know what's at stake because we don't know what normal is. We have to have an idea of what the character is risking, what their decisions are going to be impacting during this moment for it to be as important as it's supposed to be. When your inciting incident happens, your reader should already be attached to your character. The other reason that I don't like starting right in the middle of the conflict is, the big conflict, is that there's usually so many moving pieces that unless you're an extremely skilled writer, it's going to be really hard for your reader to keep up. You don't want the reader having to flip back pages like, wait, was this person this person? Was this person this person's friend? Or, you want to have that stuff established before you get into any really big conflict. However, I do also agree you don't want to start with nothing going on, right? I always recommend starting with a smaller kind of daily life sort of conflict to build character relationships, to build the idea of your character's tone of voice, kind of give an idea of who they are. So for example, if your main character is, some office guy who loves to play Dungeons and Dragons and loves to read fantasy books and fantasizes about being that strong character that makes those big choices, we need to see that, it might help for us to see that he dreams of being this person, but in reality, he's the kind of person who can't even have an honest conversation with their boss about not working overtime or about needing a raise. So that tells us that this person has these big dreams, but they don't really have that personality, that internal conflict that they have about what they deserve and who they want to be versus who they are. So I always recommend that you start with a smaller conflict to give us that idea of who the character is before dropping us into the inciting incident and the real conflict, because you need to have that attachment to the characters and you need to know what's at stake when things start to change from normal. So one thing to think about is I'm talking about longer form fiction. So I'm not necessarily talking about short stories. You have less time to do more things with short stories than you do with a novel or a novella. So keep that in mind. And then I always think too that in the opening, it's important. Wow, I sounded really Canadian for a second. In the opening, I think that you need to plant the seeds for the main conflicts or the goal for the characters. So you can do this in any point of view. You can do this in any narration style, because that's not what matters. I mean, it does matter what point of view you pick. It does matter what tense you pick, but that matters for who you are as a writer and how you want to tell the story more than it matters for how you're going to write your opening scene. Because you can see opening scenes written in a multitude of different points of view that do similar things. Like a lot of John Green novels, for instance, kind of start with like that first person talking to the reader sort of narration. And that's fine because he explains like what the interest of the main character is in telling this story. You already have an idea going in, like when you meet these characters, like, oh, this is the character that changes everything. So that's something, you know, that narration style works. Or you can have narration style where you have characters talking to each other with that third person point of view. You can use these strategies in any point of view, in any tense. The most important thing, I think, is just building who your character is, what their internal conflicts might be, and then you can build on that by throwing in external conflicts that make them battle those internal weaknesses, right? And that's when you have your inciting incident, when the normal changes. If we don't have a normal, we don't know how important this moment is. So one thing I will say though is every once in a while you see like a bait and switch, and in some genres that really works. For example, in George R.R. Martin, in the very beginning of Song and Ice and Fire series, and keep in mind it's been like a decade since I read this book, I'm not reading them again until they're completely published, and then I'll have to start at the beginning because it's been forever. But if I recall correctly, he starts with the White Walkers doing some nefarious White Walkery things, murdering somebody, I think, and then it baits and switches from this overarching scary thing that we know is happening but doesn't really play a big role in the first book too much, into letting us get to know Ned Stark and his family. And it doesn't start, if you're thinking about dropping into that main conflict, that inciting incident, what we would see us being dropped in that book probably right around the time that Ned Stark realizes that his friend has been, sorry, spoilers, if you haven't read it or watched the HBO series, don't listen to this part, has been murdered, and then he's going to get subsequently beheaded. But that's actually more like the end of the first book. That whole first book is letting us get to know the pawns and the players and the pieces. And if that first book didn't exist, we wouldn't have all these attachments emotionally to Arya and Sansa and Jon, and we wouldn't know the importance of all of these interactions. I like this. Yeah, so Aaron said that they will not, a person watching live, sorry, this is going to be on YouTube later, a person watching live said they'll not be reading that series until it's finished either. And I think that's just the way to go at this point, honestly. But my whole point is, it's almost, when you think about for the overarching conflict within that series, it's almost like the whole first book is set up for what we need to know moving forward for like the big inciting incidences. And that's okay because it's well written, it's active, it's exciting. You don't have to always jump into that really huge moment of conflict. But the important thing is to keep it active. You want to do those shows, not just those tells, so that when things change later on, you're not having to tell us, oh, this is different because, oh, this is scary because, oh, this character felt this way because. We want to already know. We want to go into that conflict with our brains already thinking, oh, sugar, that person is scared of this, or, oh, no, they promised them this. We want to be able to read through that moment of conflict without having to get these little nuggets of tell within it. So that's what I would say, is that it's really important to set up who your characters are, what their motivations are, maybe who's on which side, or who's what friend, or what that relationship is like between some of the other side characters before you get into that big changing moment. So if you go on my website, I do have some plot worksheets that are free, where it basically talks about how you're setting up normal for like this much, and then you have your inciting incident, and then you have like this much rising action, and then you have your climactic moment, and then you have your falling action and your resolution. So when you think about a novel, you have kind of that little bit of normal and that little bit of what's happened after everything's resolved, or what's happened to set up the next thing that's going to happen if it's a series. And those are small pieces, right? Those are 1, maybe 2 chapters before you're boom into it. And so the other thing I would like to say is that you can add and you can subtract at any point in time in the writing journey. Just because you started with this scene, because that's where maybe your brain started, it doesn't mean you can't go back and add more in, layer it in once you know your characters. So maybe what came to your head when you were starting to think about this story is that big inciting incident. And you're like, okay, so this is where I'm going to start writing, and you write forward from there. That's great. That's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with drafting like that. Heck, you can draft here, 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 and fill in, and it's fine. The thing is, when you're done writing, that's when you can figure out, okay, is this an opening scene that's going to draw people in? Is it going to give the information that needs to be given, setting the tone and the purpose of the story? And if it's not, how can you get there? How can you add to it? How can you take away from it? It's not unusual for somebody to send me a sample edit with like a prologue or an opening scene that is either not effective because we don't understand why it's important yet, which sometimes that works, like in murder mysteries, or like I gave the example for George R.R. Martin. Sometimes that can work. But the large majority of the time for most genres, the bait and switch doesn't necessarily work. So I might advise somebody, I would recommend pulling this moment and putting it here instead, or pulling it and holding it for a point where it's going to have a bigger impact, because your reader's going to have some sense of like, oh, this is really important because, and it's going to start either foreshadowing for them in their brain, or it's going to click some puzzle pieces together for them. So you're kind of planting seeds in that initial part, and if your seeds aren't planted, some of those big moments won't necessarily work yet. So it's not unusual for me to tell somebody, hey, I'd recommend cutting this and moving it here. It's also not unusual for me to tell somebody in a sample edit, this is a lot of tell. I would like to see more show. And because a lot of times as writers, our brain just wants to get to that big moment, right? Like that's the juicy moment. That's the part we want to write about. That's the part where we really get to show the conflict and show the movement and show the action. And so a lot of times I'll say, look, we're tell, just to get to here. I would like to see some show, a little bit of tell, some show, a little bit of tell, so that, like I said, you have that nice full character. You're setting up those moments for later. If somebody's walking really far and the fact that they're going to be lost is going to be important later in the book, show me how arduous that journey is, so that when they get lost, I'm like, they're screwed. I'm immediately nervous for them, right? If somebody is maybe not as nice as they seem, don't just tell me, yeah, they're kind of mean sometimes. Like, show a little aggression on their side. Maybe it's like some passive aggressive moment, or like maybe it's them smirking when somebody falls. Like, you can show these things without telling them, in a way that's going to engage the reader so that they're ready when that big moment of change happens, when we start seeing the mechanics of the story move that person toward what is next. And so that's my biggest thing for writing opening scenes, is I think that you need to establish your character. I think it's important to establish some hurts for that character, some hurt points. So it could be some internal conflict. It could be something in their past that they just can't move over. Something that's going to show us later on when they have to make a decision, or when they have to react to a situation, or they automatically react in a way that we're like, oh, why did you do that? It makes sense for the character, and we can either forgive them or root for them, or just like want their friends to step in because we know their friend knows that this is hard for them. It gives us that emotional moment that is emotional for the character as well. And you have to set it up for that to work well. Okay, so that's what I have to say about opening scenes. I know that was probably kind of all over the place a little bit today. I didn't have any questions. This was just based off of the Twitter poll, so I was just kind of going with, this is my thoughts as an editor. This is what I'm looking for when I'm reading that opening scene. This is what I'm looking for as a reader when I'm reading an opening scene. I need to know what's at stake, what that tone of voice is. And I don't think it's wrong to kind of lean into tropes a little bit for the opening scene. Maybe you've got one character who's gonna be that kind of snarky, lackadaisical, lets everybody else kind of do things for them, but always has a quip. And that's kind of who they are. It's not 100% who they are, but you can utilize that. You can make that work for you, because the nice thing about tropes is that they're comfortable for readers. Yes, they can be done poorly. Yes, they can be overdone. Yes, they can be leaned into too hard. But as a reader, when you're first getting into a book, having a little bit of a trope character or a little bit of kind of an expected feel to something can be comforting. It can draw you in. It can help you settle into the moment, particularly when the world around us is just anxiety inducing to the max. Having something that feels comforting is actually a good thing. And as a writer, you can then take them from that trope into something more surprising if you choose to, as the character arc moves, right? So I would say don't shy away too hard from tropes. If it works for your story and for your character, it can actually work to draw in a reader as well. And then for sequels, I just wanted to put in that you want to do a little bit of reminding of what's happened in past books, but you don't want to just sit there and have like a whole explanation, like exposition. I don't know. I just totally made two words one. Summary of what happened in the previous book, because you're assuming if this is already a fully published series that probably they're hopefully going from one book to the next book, like binge reading, right? And if they're not, you want to have enough reminders in there that if it's only been like 6 months since they read the book the first time, or like a year, but it really stuck with them, you're kind of reminding them like, oh, hey, this happened. And you can do that through like character dialogue, character back and forth, somebody having like an internal moment about something, or somebody getting triggered by seeing something. But you don't have to lay it all out. If it's a sequel, you can assume that the person read the first book and remembers it. So don't waste too much of your time, especially in that opening chapter, rehashing. Make sure that you're still having forward movement as well for the sequels. That's important. Okay, hopefully that was helpful. I am going to turn this off now so that I can start adding the text stuff for the YouTube video for people who are hearing impaired, so that they can also see this information. Hopefully I'll make it a little bit less scattered when I do that. Okay, have a good day. Bye, guys.